The moment Dawson Thatcher stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Lovelock, Nevada, 3 men stopped what they were doing to stare, and the 4th one nearly walked his horse into a water trough. She pretended not to notice as she adjusted her traveling dress and squinted against the harsh August sun of 1877, but her cheeks flushed pink, despite her best efforts to remain composed. She had known coming west would draw attention. A young woman of 22 traveling alone always did, but she had not anticipated the intensity of the gazes that followed her down the wooden sidewalk toward the general store. Inside the dim coolness of the mercantile, she was examining a bolt of calico fabric when she heard the growl. It was low, rumbling, and unmistakably human, though it carried the warning of a grizzly bear protecting its territory. Dawson turned her head slightly and caught sight of him through the window. A mountain of a man with shoulders that seemed to span half the street, dressed in buckskin and worn denim, his dark hair falling past his collar in waves that looked like they had been tamed by nothing more than his own rough fingers. He stood near the hitching post, and the man he was glaring at, one of the ones who had been staring at her moments before, suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. That would be Kade Dempsey, the shopkeeper said quietly, noticing the direction of her gaze. He was an older man with spectacles perched on his nose and the careful manner of someone who had learned when to speak and when to stay silent. Lives up in the mountains most of the year, comes down for supplies every few weeks, keeps to himself mostly. He seems rather protective of the town, Dawson observed, turning back to the fabric with what she hoped was casual disinterest. The shopkeeper made a non-committal sound. Protective of something, that is certain. She purchased the calico along with thread, needles, and various other supplies she would need for her new position as schoolteacher. The previous teacher had married a rancher and moved to California, leaving Lovelock in desperate need of someone educated enough to handle the dozen or so children who lived in town and on the surrounding ranches. Dawson had responded to the advertisement back in Boston, where she had been living with her aunt after her parents passed from fever. The West had seemed like an adventure, a chance to start fresh where nobody knew her story or pitied her for her losses. When she emerged from the store with her packages, the mountain man was gone, but she could feel the absence of him like a change in air pressure before a storm. The men who had been loitering had also disappeared, and the street seemed strangely quiet for mid-afternoon. Dawson made her way to the boarding house where she had arranged lodging until the small teacher's cottage behind the schoolhouse could be properly cleaned and furnished. Mrs. Colby, who ran the boarding house, was a formidable woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and a sharp eye for detail. She showed Dawson to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor, chattering all the while about the town and its inhabitants. "You will do well here, Miss Thatcher, provided you keep a respectable reputation. We are a decent town, though we get our share of troublemakers passing through. Cowboys and miners mostly, looking for drink and cards. You will want to avoid the saloon side of the street after dark." "I have no intention of frequenting saloons at any hour," Dawson assured her, unpinning her hat and setting it on the narrow bed. "Good, good. Now supper is at 6 sharp. We have 3 other boarders currently, a mining engineer, a clerk from the land office, and Mr. Dempsey when he is in town, though he keeps irregular hours." Mrs. Colby pursed her lips slightly. "He is rough around the edges, but he pays promptly and does not cause trouble." "Well, not the usual kind of trouble anyway." Dawson felt her pulse quicken at the mention of his name but kept her expression neutral. "The mountain man. That is what some call him. He has a claim up in the Humboldt Range, though what he does up there is his own business. Trapping, mostly, I believe. Some prospecting. He sells furs and occasionally brings down game for the butcher. Mrs. Colby moved toward the door, then paused. He is a good man, Miss Thatcher, despite appearances. Fought in the war the Union side and came west after like so many did. Lost his family back east to cholera. He does not talk about it, but word gets around in a small town. After Mrs. Colby left, Dawson stood at the window looking out over the town. Lovelock was small, perhaps 200 souls, built along the Humboldt River where the water made the desert bloom green in a narrow corridor. Beyond the town, the mountains rose in jagged peaks, purple and mysterious in the afternoon light. Somewhere up there, Kade Dempsey lived alone in the wilderness, coming down only when necessity demanded. She wondered what kind of man chose such solitude, and then wondered why she was wondering about him at all. That evening at supper, she met the other boarders. The mining engineer was a thin, nervous man named Horace, who spoke extensively about ore grades and shaft depths, until Mrs. Colby told him firmly that such talk was not suitable for the dinner table. The land office clerk, Mr. Peters, was more pleasant, asking polite questions about her journey west and her plans for the school. Kade Dempsey's chair remained empty. He is likely still in the mountains, Mrs. Colby said, noticing Dawson's glance at the vacant place. He does not always come down when expected, but he had been in town that afternoon. Dawson remembered the growl, the way the other man had scurried away. She focused on her plate, telling herself it was none of her concern where the mountain man chose to take his meals. The next morning, she walked to the schoolhouse to assess what needed to be done before classes could begin. It was a simple wooden building with a small bell tower, one large room for instruction, and the cottage out back where she would live. The interior smelled of dust and disuse, but it was structurally sound, with good windows that let in plenty of light and a wood stove that would keep the children warm come winter. She was sweeping the floor, her sleeves rolled up and her hair tied back with a kerchief, when she heard boots on the steps outside. Heavy boots, moving with the confident tread of someone who knew exactly where he was going. The door swung open, and Kade Dempsey had to duck slightly to clear the frame. Up close, he was even more imposing than he had seemed through the mercantile window. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders and arms that strained the fabric of his shirt muscles built from years of hard labor in unforgiving country. His face was weathered and tanned, with a strong jaw covered in dark stubble and eyes the color of a winter sky. Those eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her forget to breathe for a moment. "Miss Thatcher," he said, his voice a deep rumble. "I am Kade Dempsey. The town council asked me to check if you needed anything before you settle in." She leaned the broom against the wall, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look. "That is kind of you, Mr. Dempsey. The cottage needs some cleaning and there is a loose board on the back step, but otherwise everything seems in order." He nodded once, a sharp economical movement. "I will fix the step. Anything else? The stovepipe could use inspection before winter, and I believe there might be a family of mice in the cottage cupboard." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "I will handle it." He moved past her toward the cottage, and she caught the scent of pine and wood smoke, leather, and something indefinably masculine that made her stomach flutter. She returned to her sweeping, trying to focus on the rhythmic motion rather than the sounds of him working outside. When she ventured to the cottage an hour later, she found him on his knees examining the stovepipe with the practiced ease of someone who knew his way around tools and repairs. "The pipe is sound, but the damper was stuck," he said without looking up. "It will draw properly now. Fix the step and set traps for the mice. Leave them be for a day or two, then I will come back and clear them out." "Thank you," Dawson said, genuinely grateful. How much do I owe you for your time?" Now he did look up, and there was definite disapproval in his expression. "Nothing. The town hired you to teach the children. It is the least we can do to make sure you are comfortable. Still, your time has value, Mr. Dempsey." He stood, unfolding to his full impressive height in the small cottage. "So does yours, Miss Thatcher. Consider it an even trade." She wanted to argue, but something in his tone suggested that further protest would be pointless. "Then I thank you again." He gathered his tools, and she walked with him back through the schoolhouse. At the door, he paused and turned to face her with an expression that was suddenly fierce. "If anyone in this town bothers you, you tell me. Understood?" The protective intensity in his voice sent a shiver down her spine that was not entirely unpleasant. "I am sure that will not be necessary, but I appreciate the offer." It was not an offer. It was a statement of fact. He settled his wide-brimmed hat on his head. "Good day, Miss Thatcher." She watched him stride away, his movements fluid despite his size, and realized that her hands were trembling slightly. She told herself it was simply the stress of relocation and new responsibilities. But she knew she was lying. Over the next week, Dawson threw herself into preparing the school. She scrubbed floors and windows, organized the meager collection of books, prepared lesson plans for students ranging from 6 to 14 years old. Parents began stopping by to introduce themselves and their children, most of them friendly and welcoming, though a few of the mothers looked at her with the suspicious eyes of women who worried about an unmarried young schoolteacher around their husbands. She saw Kade twice more during that time. Once when he came to clear the mouse traps as promised, refusing her offer of coffee with a polite but firm decline. And once across the street when she was at the mercantile, and a cowboy made a crude comment as she passed. The cowboy had barely gotten the words out before Kade materialized from somewhere, his hand on the man's shoulder and his voice so low and dangerous that Dawson could not hear the words. The cowboy went pale, apologized profusely in her direction, and hurried away as though his boots were on fire. Kade had not looked at her that time, just melted back into the crowd as though he had never been there at all. But her heart had hammered in her chest for a full 5 minutes afterward, and she found herself scanning the street for him even when she knew he was already gone. "You have caught his attention," Mrs. Colby said one evening over supper. The other boarders had already excused themselves, leaving just the two women in the dining room. Dawson looked up from her cup of tea, feigning ignorance. "I am sure I do not know what you mean." The older woman gave her a knowing look. "Kade Dempsey has lived in these mountains for near about 8 years now. In all that time, I have never seen him take notice of a woman the way he notices you. He watches you like a wolf watches his mate, possessive and protective. That is absurd." "He barely knows me." But Dawson's cheeks heated with a blush that betrayed her. "Some things do not require long acquaintance. My late husband decided he would marry me about 5 minutes after we met. We had 42 good years before the pneumonia took him. Mrs. Colby reached over and patted Dawson's hand. "Kade is a hard man in some ways, hardened by life and loss, but he is good through and through. If he has decided you are his to protect, then you are safer in this town than the mayor's gold watch." "I am not his anything," Dawson protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Not yet," Mrs. Colby agreed with a small smile, "but I would wager my best Sunday hat that changes before the leaves turn." School began on a Monday morning in early September, when the worst of the summer heat had passed, but winter was still a distant threat. Dawson had 14 students ranging from little Emma Foster, who was 6 and solemn, to James Miller, who was 14 and clearly considered himself too old for schooling. She divided them into groups by ability rather than age, which seemed to surprise some of the older children who were used to more chaotic instruction. She loved teaching from the first moment. The challenge of engaging minds that ranged from learning their letters to grappling with geometry. The satisfaction of seeing comprehension dawn in a child's eyes. The simple joy of reading aloud and watching even the most restless students grow still and attentive. The days fell into a pleasant rhythm. Morning lessons, lunch break where the children played outside, afternoon lessons, then time for her to grade work and prepare for the next day. On Friday of that first week, she dismissed the children at 3 o'clock and was tidying the classroom when she heard a commotion outside. Raised voices, one of them young and frightened. She hurried to the door and saw James Miller backing away from two rough-looking men on horseback. Cowboys from one of the distant ranches, by the look of them, and well into their cups despite the early hour. "Come on, boy, we just want to know if the new teacher is as pretty as they say," one of them was saying, his words slurred. "You can introduce us all proper-like." "She is busy," James said, trying to sound brave but his voice cracking. "You should come back another time." Dawson stepped out onto the schoolhouse steps. "Gentlemen, can I help you with something?" Both men turned to look at her, and their expressions shifted into something that made her skin crawl. "Well now," the first one said. "They did not lie, did they, Chet? She is a pretty little thing." "Real pretty," the second one agreed, dismounting with the unsteady movements of the drunk. "What say you show us around the school, teacher lady? We never got much learning ourselves, but we are always eager to improve our minds." His companion laughed at this, a harsh braying sound. Dawson kept her expression calm despite the fear climbing her throat. "School hours are over for the day. If you wish to discuss educational matters, you may call during appropriate hours when you are sober." "Now that is not very friendly," the first man said, also dismounting. "We came all this way just to make your acquaintance." James moved to stand beside Dawson on the steps, his young face set with determination. "You need to leave, mister. This is not right. Boy, you better get on home before you get hurt," the second man said, his tone hardening. "James, go," Dawson said quietly. "It is all right." But James shook his head stubbornly, and her heart swelled with pride even as her fear increased. The two men were advancing on the steps now, and she was calculating whether she could get inside and bar the door before they reached her when a shadow fell across the yard. "You boys lost." The voice was deceptively mild, but it stopped both cowboys in their tracks. They turned to find Kade Dempsey standing at the edge of the schoolyard, his hands loose at his sides and his expression utterly calm. He did not look angry or threatening. He simply looked inevitable, like a mountain or a storm, a force of nature that could not be reasoned with or deterred. "This is not your business, mountain man," the first cowboy said, but his bravado had evaporated like morning dew. "You are on school property bothering the teacher and a student." "That makes it my business." Kade took 3 steps forward, and despite the fact that he made no aggressive moves, both cowboys stepped back. "I suggest you mount up and ride out. If I see you near this school again, or near Miss Thatcher anywhere in town, we are going to have a different kind of conversation." The cowboys exchanged glances. The second one tried to muster some dignity. "We did not mean any harm, just being friendly." "Your kind of friendly is not welcome here. Go on now." They mounted quickly, suddenly eager to be elsewhere. As they rode off, Kade watched them until they disappeared around a bend in the road. Only then did he turn to look at Dawson and James. His expression softened fractionally when he saw the boy standing protectively beside her. "That took courage, son," he said to James. "But next time someone like that shows up, you run and find me or the sheriff. Your job is not to protect Miss Thatcher against grown men. That is our job." Understood, James nodded, clearly relieved to be praised rather than scolded. Yes, sir. Good. Now get on home before your mother worries. After James left, Kade climbed the steps to where Dawson still stood. Up close, she could see the tension in his jaw, the barely controlled anger in his eyes. Are you all right? He asked, his voice gentler than she had heard it before. Yes, thank you. They did not touch me, but I confess I was frightened. Something dark passed over his features. They will not be back. I will make certain of that. How did you know to come? She realized she was shaking now that the danger had passed, her hands trembling as reaction set in. I make it a point to be around when school lets out, just in case. He said it matter-of-factly, as though it was the most natural thing in the world for him to rearrange his schedule to watch over her. Come on, I will walk you to the boarding house. I can manage the walk. It is only 3 blocks. He gave her a look that was equal parts exasperated and amused. Miss Thatcher, I just ran off 2 drunk cowboys who had bad intentions. Do you really think I am going to let you walk those 3 blocks alone? She wanted to argue on principle, to assert her independence and capability. But the truth was she felt safer with him beside her, and she was tired of pretending otherwise. Very well, thank you. They walked in silence for half a block before he spoke again. Those men worked for the Bar 7 ranch. I will ride out there tomorrow and have a word with the owner. He runs a decent operation and will not appreciate his men causing trouble in town. Will there be violence? Not if they are smart. He glanced at her, and his expression softened again. You do not need to worry about it. Just focus on your teaching and let me handle the other matters. She stopped walking and turned to face him. Mr. Dempsey, why are you doing this? You have gone out of your way repeatedly to help me, to protect me. I am grateful, truly, but I do not understand why you have taken such an interest in my welfare. He met her gaze steadily, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, because the moment I saw you step off that stagecoach, something in me recognized something in you. I have lived alone for a long time, Miss Thatcher. Chosen to live alone because it was easier than risking more loss. But then you arrived, and for the first time in 8 years, being alone felt wrong. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I am not good with fancy speech. I am a simple man who lives a simple life. But I know what I know, and I know you matter. So I will keep you safe, whether you understand my reasons or not. Dawson's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. That is the most words I have heard you speak all at once. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, transforming his stern features into something softer and unexpectedly handsome. Do not get used to it. I am not much for talking. I am beginning to realize that. She started walking again, acutely aware of him beside her, the way his shoulder occasionally brushed hers on the narrow sidewalk. Mrs. Colby mentioned you fought in the war. His expression closed slightly. I did. Rather not talk about it if it is all the same to you. Of course. I apologize for prying. They had reached the boarding house. He walked her up onto the porch, then settled his hat more firmly on his head. I need to head back up to the mountains for a few days. There is a trap line I need to check before the weather turns, but I will be back by next Friday. If anything happens while I am gone, you go straight to Sheriff Morrison. He is a good man and he knows to watch out for you. You told the sheriff to watch out for me. She did not know whether to be touched or exasperated. I did. No apology, just simple fact. Take care of yourself, Miss Thatcher. Dawson, she said impulsively. My name is Dawson. His eyes warmed. Dawson, he repeated as though tasting the name. Then you should call me Kade. All right, Kade. She liked the way it felt in her mouth, solid and strong like the man himself. He nodded once, then turned and walked away with that same fluid grace. She watched until he disappeared around the corner, then went inside where Mrs. Colby was waiting with a knowing expression and a fresh pot of tea. The following week passed quietly. Dawson fell into the rhythm of teaching, learning her students' strengths and weaknesses, adapting her lessons to keep them engaged. She moved into the cottage behind the school, grateful for the privacy and independence, even though Mrs. Colby's cooking was far superior to her own attempts. The cottage was small but cozy, with a main room that served as kitchen and sitting area, a bedroom barely large enough for the narrow bed and wardrobe, and a small porch that looked out toward the mountains. She found herself looking at those mountains often, wondering which peak sheltered Kade's cabin, wondering what he did all day in that vast wilderness. She tried to tell herself that her interest was merely curiosity, but she knew better. Something had shifted in her when he had spoken with such raw honesty about recognizing something in her. No man had ever looked at her the way he did, as though she was both precious and capable, something to be protected but also respected. Friday afternoon arrived, and as she dismissed the children, she found herself scanning the street with more eagerness than she wanted to admit. But there was no sign of Kade's tall figure, and disappointment settled in her chest like a stone. She was being foolish. He had said he would be back by Friday, not that he would come see her immediately upon his return. She was preparing supper in her cottage kitchen when she heard boots on the porch steps. Her pulse jumped even before the knock came. She smoothed her apron and opened the door to find Kade standing there with a brace of rabbits in one hand and an awkward expression on his face. "Thought you might be tired of boarding house fare," he said gruffly. "These are fresh cleaned. I can show you how to cook them if you do not know." Warmth flooded through her. "That is very thoughtful. I do know how to prepare rabbit, but I would welcome the company if you would care to stay for supper." He looked surprised, as though he had not expected the invitation. "I would not want to impose. You would not be. I have been alone all week and would appreciate conversation with someone whose voice has finished changing." She smiled, thinking of her students. "Come in, please." He entered carefully, his size making the small cottage seem even more cramped. He set the rabbits on her kitchen counter and stood uncertainly, clearly uncomfortable in the domestic space. Dawson hid her amusement and gestured to the small table. "Sit. I have coffee on, and you can tell me about your week while I get these started." To her surprise, he did as she suggested. As she prepared the rabbits and set them to cook with wild onions and herbs, he told her about his trap line in the mountains, the beaver dam he had found, the mountain lion tracks he had seen near his cabin. His voice was deep and rumbling, oddly soothing despite his economical use of words. She found herself relaxing, the simple domesticity of cooking while he talked, creating an intimacy that felt both comfortable and charged with possibility. "What made you come west?" he asked eventually, turning the conversation to her. She told him about Boston, about losing her parents, about the stifling propriety of living with her aunt who meant well but treated her like fragile porcelain. "I needed to be somewhere that I could breathe," she said, checking the rabbits. "Somewhere I could be useful and independent." The West seemed to offer that opportunity. "It is hard country," he said. "Harder for women, perhaps, but it is also honest country. People say what they mean and mean what they say. I appreciate that after years of Boston society where everything is layers of politeness, hiding what people truly think." He smiled slightly. "You would not have liked me much in Boston. I have never been good at pretty words and social dancing." "I like you just fine here in Nevada," she said, then blushed at her own forwardness. His eyes darkened with something that made her stomach flutter. "Do you?" "I do." She busied herself with the cooking, using it as an excuse to avoid his intense gaze. "You have been very kind to me." Kindness has nothing to do with it. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Dawson served the supper, her hands not quite steady, and they ate in a silence that was both companionable and charged with unspoken possibilities. Kade complimented her cooking, which was generous given that it was simple fare, and helped her clean up afterward with an ease that suggested he was accustomed to taking care of himself. At the door, as he was preparing to leave, he paused and looked down at her. "Would you take a walk with me tomorrow? There is a place I would like to show you up in the foothills. Beautiful country if you are interested." Her heart soared. "I would like that very much. I will come by at 9 if that suits. Bring a canteen and wear sturdy boots. It is a bit of a climb." After he left, Dawson stood on her small porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. She could still smell the pine and leather scent of him in her cottage, could still feel the warmth of his presence. Mrs. Colby had been right. Something was happening between them, something inevitable and thrilling and slightly terrifying. She went to bed that night with a smile on her face and dreams filled with winter sky eyes and strong, gentle hands. The next morning dawned clear and beautiful, the September air carrying just a hint of the autumn to come. Dawson dressed in her most practical skirt and shirtwaist, laced up her sturdy boots, and plaited her hair in a simple braid. She was ready and waiting on her porch when Kade arrived precisely at 9, leading a gentle-looking mare. "This is Juniper," he said, patting the horse's neck. "She is a calm girl, easy for someone not used to rough trail riding. My gelding is tied at the livery. I thought you might be more comfortable with your own mount rather than riding double." It was a thoughtful gesture, respectful of propriety while still allowing them time together. Dawson had learned to ride as a girl but had not been on a horse in years. Kade helped her mount with easy competence, his hands strong and sure, then walked beside her as they headed to the livery to collect his own horse. His gelding was a massive buckskin that suited him perfectly, powerful, capable, and no nonsense. They rode out of town at an easy pace, heading toward the foothills where the desert began its transformation into mountain terrain. Kade led them along trails that were barely visible to her untrained eye, navigating with the confidence of someone who knew this country intimately. As they climbed higher, the view opened up behind them. Lovelock spread out in the valley, a small collection of buildings following the green ribbon of the river through the brown desert landscape. Beyond, the alkali flats shimmered in the morning sun and distant mountains made purple shadows on the horizon. "It is beautiful," Dawson breathed, reining in Juniper to take it all in. "It is honest," Kade said, echoing her words from the night before. "What you see is what you get. No pretense, no hidden meanings. I came to appreciate that after the war, after the lies and politics and men dying for causes they did not understand." She heard the old pain in his voice and reached across the space between their horses to touch his arm briefly. "I am sorry for whatever you lost." He looked at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. "We all lost something in that war, but it is long past, and dwelling does not change it." He nudged his horse forward. "Come on, there is more to see." He led her to a meadow sheltered by tall pines, where a spring bubbled up from the rocks to form a small pool before trickling away downhill. The grass was thick and green, dotted with late-season wildflowers in purple and gold. It was a hidden paradise, secret and serene, and Dawson understood immediately why he had brought her here. They dismounted and let the horses graze while they sat on a flat rock near the spring. Kade pulled jerky and biscuits from his saddle bag, along with 2 apples that were slightly bruised but still sweet. They ate in comfortable silence, listening to the wind in the pines and the quiet sound of water over stone. "I built my cabin about 2 miles from here," Kade said eventually. Higher up, in a spot that is defensible and has good water year-round. It is not much one room, a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, but it is mine and it is peaceful. You get lonely? She asked, genuinely curious. He considered the question. Sometimes. Mostly I am too busy to think about it. There is always work to be done hunting, trapping, cutting firewood for winter, maintaining the cabin and outbuildings. When I do come down to town for supplies, the noise and crowds feel overwhelming after the quiet of the mountains. He glanced at her. Lately, though, I find myself making excuses to stay in town longer. Her heart skipped. Do you? You know I do. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. I am not good at courting, Dawson. I do not know how to speak pretty or act proper. I am a rough man who has lived a rough life. But I am honest and I work hard, and I would do everything in my power to make sure you were happy and safe, if that matters to you. She stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. Are you saying you want to court me? I am saying I want a lot more than that, but courting is where decent folks start. His jaw was tight, his eyes searching hers. If you are interested, if I have not misread this thing between us. Joy bubbled up inside her, bright and effervescent. You have not misread anything. I would very much like for you to court me, Kade. The tension drained from his shoulders, and he smiled a real, genuine smile that transformed his face and made her heart ache with the beauty of it. Good, he said simply. Then, more hesitantly, can I kiss you? I know it is forward for a first outing, but I have wanted to since the moment I saw you, and I am not much for waiting when I know what I want. Instead of answering with words, Dawson leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. For a moment he went still with surprise, then his hand came up to cup the back of her head, gentle despite his size and strength. The kiss was slow and sweet, full of promise and possibility. When they finally drew apart, both of them were breathing hard. Well, she said, her voice not quite steady, I suppose that answers your question. He laughed, a rusty sound as though he did not use it often enough. I suppose it does. They stayed in the meadow for another hour, talking about everything and nothing. He told her more about his life in the mountains, and she told him about her hopes for the school and her students. The conversation flowed easily despite his tendency toward brevity, and she found she could read volumes in his small gestures and expressions. He was not a man who wasted words, but when he spoke, he meant what he said absolutely. The ride back to town felt too short. At her cottage, he helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. I will be staying in town for a few days, he said. Need to resupply and talk to some folks about winter work. May I call on you tomorrow evening? I would be disappointed if you did not. He kissed her again, briefer this time but no less sweet, then rode away leading Juniper back to the livery. Dawson floated into her cottage, her whole body humming with happiness. She had come west looking for a fresh start and independence, and somehow she had found something infinitely more precious. Over the next weeks, Kade courted her with a quiet intensity that took her breath away. He showed up at the school every afternoon when classes let out, his presence ensuring that no one bothered her. He brought her gifts from the mountain's interesting rocks, perfectly preserved bird feathers, a deer hide he had tanned himself that was soft as butter. He took her on long walks around the town and into the foothills, showing her the hidden beauty of the desert landscape. And he talked to her, really talked, opening up in ways she suspected he had not done with anyone in years. He told her about growing up in Ohio, about his parents and younger sister who had all died in the cholera epidemic of 1866, about joining the army at 17 and fighting through the last brutal year of the war, about coming west because he could not stand to be in places that reminded him of everything he had lost. I thought being alone was the answer. he said one evening as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Thought if I kept to myself, I would not have to risk losing anyone else. But that is not living, Dawson. That is just existing. She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. What changed? You. He looked at her, his eyes serious. The moment I saw you, something woke up inside me that I thought was dead. I tried to tell myself to leave it alone, to let you be. But then I saw how other men looked at you, and something primitive in me snarled mine. I knew I was done for. She laughed softly. I noticed the growling. I pretended I did not like it, but that was a lie. There is something thrilling about being claimed so fiercely. Is that what you want? To be claimed by a mountain man who barely knows how to live among civilized folk? Yes, she said simply. That is exactly what I want. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, his arms wrapping around her in an embrace that made her feel cherished and protected. When they finally broke apart, both of them flushed and breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. I want to marry you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I know it is fast and people will talk. But I am 30 years old, Dawson, and I have lived through enough to know that when you find something precious, you do not let it go. I love you. I think I have loved you since that first moment, and every day since has only made it stronger. Tears pricked her eyes. I love you too, and yes, I will marry you. His breath released in a rush, and he pulled her close again, burying his face in her hair. Thank God, he murmured. I was prepared to court you properly for however long it took, but I was hoping you would not make me wait too long. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Lovelock. Mrs. Colby cried happy tears, and half the town turned out to witness the mountain man, and the schoolteacher pledged their lives to each other. Dawson wore a dress of soft blue wool that brought out her eyes, and Kade wore new clothes that he was clearly uncomfortable in, though he bore the discomfort stoically. Sheriff Morrison stood up as a witness, along with Mrs. Colby, and the minister's wife played a slightly out-of-tune piano for the ceremony. It was simple and imperfect and absolutely beautiful, and when Kade kissed her as his wife, Dawson felt like her heart would burst from happiness. The question of where they would live had been a source of some discussion. Kade's cabin was too remote for her to continue teaching, and her cottage was too small for 2 people, especially when one of them was as large as Kade. The solution came from an unexpected source. The town council offered to build them a small house on a plot of land near the school, with the understanding that Dawson would continue teaching, and Kade would help with various town needs during the winter months when trapping was impossible. It is a good compromise, Kade had said when they discussed it. I can still go up to my cabin during prime trapping season, but we will have a proper home base here in town, and you can keep teaching, which I know you love. The house was finished just before the first snow, a sturdy 2-room structure with a real kitchen and a bedroom large enough for the beautiful carved bed that Kade made himself during the long autumn evenings. Moving in together as a married couple felt both thrilling and terrifying. Dawson had lived alone or with family her entire life, and suddenly sharing space with this large, quiet man required adjustment on both sides. But they learned each other's rhythms. She discovered that he was an early riser who liked to watch the sunrise with his coffee, that he was surprisingly neat for a man who lived rough, that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. He learned that she was not a morning person, that she liked to read before bed, that she hummed tunelessly when she was concentrating on something. They learned each other's bodies too, in the privacy of their bedroom. Kade was gentle despite his size and strength, patient with her inexperience, and passionate in ways that left her breathless and amazed. She had not expected marriage to be so physically satisfying, had been told by well-meaning matrons that marital relations were a duty to be endured. But with Kade, it was joy and connection, and a physical expression of the love that grew deeper with each passing day. Winter settled over Lovelock with surprising gentleness that first year. Snow fell, but not in the crushing amounts that could isolate the town, and the temperatures stayed manageable. Kade worked odd jobs around town fixing roofs, chopping wood for elderly residents, helping at the livery. Dawson taught her students through the cold months, delighting in their progress and the relationships she was building with them and their families. In the evenings, they would sit by their fire, Kade carving or mending tools while Dawson graded papers or planned lessons. Sometimes they talked, and sometimes they simply enjoyed the comfortable silence. It was a quiet life, simple and domestic, and Dawson found she loved it more than she had ever loved the social whirl of Boston. Christmas came, and they celebrated with the town a party at the church hall with food and music and children racing around in excited circles. Kade gave her a necklace he had made from polished river stones and silver wire, primitive but beautiful in its simplicity. She gave him a new fur-lined coat she had sewn herself with leather she purchased from the tanner and fur he had provided. He wore it constantly afterward, claiming it was the finest coat he had ever owned. January brought harder weather. A blizzard howled down from the mountains, piling snow 4 feet deep in the streets and keeping everyone housebound for 3 days. Dawson and Kade weathered it together, grateful for the supplies they had laid in and the tight construction of their home. They played cards, told stories, made love by firelight, and talked about the future they were building together. "I want children," Dawson said one evening as the wind screamed outside. "I know it is dangerous, and I know it is hard work, but I want to fill this house with family. I want to give you back some of what you lost." Kade pulled her close, his arms tight around her. "I want that too, when you are ready. But know that you are enough, Dawson. Even if it is just the two of us for the rest of our lives, that is more than I ever hoped to have." "Still," she said, snuggling against his chest, "I think I would like 3 or 4, enough to be a proper family." He laughed softly. "Then I will do my best to accommodate that wish, Mrs. Dempsey." Spring arrived with its usual desert suddenness, the snow melting into rushing streams and the world exploding into brief, brilliant green. Kade prepared for his spring trapline, packing supplies and checking his equipment with the methodical care of someone who knew his life might depend on being properly prepared. "I will be gone about 6 weeks," he told Dawson the night before he planned to leave. "Longer if the trapping is good. But I will send word when I can, and if you need me for any reason, you tell Sheriff Morrison. He knows how to reach me in an emergency." She hated the thought of him being gone so long, but understood it was necessary. Trapping season was short, and the income from the furs would help supplement the modest salary she earned as a teacher. "I will miss you," she said, helping him pack. "I will miss you more." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "This is the first time I have left for the mountains and not wanted to stay there forever. You have changed everything for me, Dawson." "Good," she said, fighting tears, "because you have changed everything for me too." He left at first light, and she stood on the porch watching until he disappeared into the foothills. The house felt empty without him, too quiet and too large despite its small size. She threw herself into her teaching and her friendships in town, particularly with Mrs. Colby and a few of the other women who had welcomed her warmly. But the nights were long and lonely, and she found herself counting the days until his return. 4 weeks into his absence, she woke one morning feeling queasy. She attributed it to something she had eaten until the same thing happened the next day, and the next. Dawson was a practical woman with a good education, and it did not take her long to recognize the signs. She was carrying Kade's child. Joy and fear warred inside her. Joy because she had meant what she said about wanting children, about building a family with him. Fear because she knew the dangers of childbirth, knew too many women who had died bringing new life into the world. And Kade was still weeks away from returning. She confided in Mrs. Colby, who confirmed her suspicions and promptly took charge. "You will be fine," the older woman said firmly. "We have a good doctor in town and you are young and healthy. By my reckoning, you will birth sometime in December, which gives us plenty of time to prepare." "I want to tell Kade in person," Dawson said, "not through a message. Then you will wait until he returns. But child, you are glowing with it. He is going to know the moment he sees you." Mrs. Colby was right. When Kade returned 3 weeks later, thinner and weathered from his time in the mountains but with a substantial pile of prime furs to show for his work, he took one look at Dawson and dropped his pack. "You are pregnant," he said, his voice filled with wonder. She nodded, suddenly nervous. "About 3 months along, we think." "Are you happy?" He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet despite her laughing protests. "Happy does not begin to cover it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are giving me back everything I lost and more. You are giving me a future." He set her down carefully, as though she were made of glass, and dropped to his knees to press his face against her still flat stomach. Dawson ran her fingers through his hair, her own tears falling freely now. This man, this strong, rough, beautiful man, was going to be the father of her child. She could not imagine anyone better for the role. The summer passed in a haze of happiness. Kade refused to return to the mountains, declaring he would not leave her alone while she was carrying his child. He took on more work around town, and the income combined with what he had made from the spring furs was enough to keep them comfortable. He was simultaneously overprotective and sweetly attentive, driving her to distraction with his constant worry while making her fall more in love with him every day. Her body changed as the child grew inside her. Her belly swelled, and she felt the first flutters of movement in late summer. The night she felt the baby kick for the first time, she grabbed Kade's hand and pressed it to her stomach. The look of awe on his face when he felt his child move brought tears to both their eyes. "That is our baby," he said wonderingly. "Our child, growing strong and healthy." "Our child," she agreed, covering his hand with her own. School started again in September, and Dawson continued teaching despite her pregnancy. Some of the more traditional parents worried it was not proper, but most understood that the town needed her and that she was perfectly capable of continuing her work. Kade made sure she did not overexert herself, showing up midday to check on her with an intensity that would have been irritating if it were not so clearly rooted in love and concern. By November, she was large enough that moving around was becoming difficult. The doctor recommended she stop teaching after Thanksgiving, and though she hated to leave her students mid-term, she knew it was the wise choice. Kade hired Sarah, the wife of the mining engineer, to take over the teaching duties temporarily. Sarah was educated and willing, if not quite as passionate about education as Dawson herself. The final weeks of pregnancy were hard. Dawson was uncomfortable constantly, her body no longer her own. She had trouble sleeping, and her ankles swelled, and she felt enormous and ungainly. But Kade never made her feel anything less than beautiful. He rubbed her aching feet, brought her tea in the mornings, held her when she cried from hormones and frustration, and told her constantly how amazing and strong she was. On December 15th, during a gentle snowfall that blanketed Lovelock in pristine white, her labor began. Mrs. Colby took charge, sending for the doctor and settling Dawson into the bedroom with the calm competence of a woman who had attended many births. Kade was frantic, pacing the main room and driving Mrs. Colby to distraction, until she finally ordered him to sit down and stay out of the way. Labor was long and hard and more painful than Dawson had imagined possible. There were moments when she was sure she could not continue, when the pain was too much and her body too exhausted. But Mrs. Colby and the doctor coached her through it, and somewhere in the other room she could hear Kade's voice, rough with emotion, telling her how strong she was, how proud he was, how much he loved her. Just as the winter sun was setting on the shortest day of the year, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that announced her displeasure at the cold and the bright lights. The doctor placed the baby, cleaned and wrapped in soft blankets, in Dawson's arms, and she stared down at the tiny, red, perfect face with overwhelming love. "You have a daughter," the doctor said with a smile. "A healthy baby girl. Can I let him in now, Mrs. Colby asked, her own eyes damp with tears. "The poor man is about to wear a hole in your floor." Dawson nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Kade burst through the door, his face pale and his eyes wild, and stopped short at the sight of his wife and child. He approached slowly, as though afraid to break the spell, and sank to his knees beside the bed. "She is perfect," he whispered, reaching out one large finger to stroke the baby's tiny hand. As if in response, the baby wrapped her miniature fingers around his, holding on with surprising strength. "She is absolutely perfect. What should we name her?" Dawson asked, watching her husband fall in love with their daughter. "Mary," he said without hesitation, "after my mother, if that suits you." "Mary Dempsey," Dawson tried out the name. "It is beautiful. Welcome to the world, Mary." They spent the rest of the evening in the bedroom, the three of them cocooned together while the snow fell outside. Mrs. Colby brought food and fussed over them, and the doctor checked on them one more time before declaring mother and baby healthy and leaving them to rest. Eventually, Mary fell asleep, and Kade carefully placed her in the cradle he had built, his movements gentle despite his size. "You were so brave," he told Dawson, returning to sit beside the bed and take her hand. "I have seen men face enemy fire with less courage than you showed today." "I was terrified," she admitted, "but I wanted her so much, wanted to give you this gift." "The gift was not just her," he said seriously. "It was you, choosing to risk yourself to bring new life into the world. That is the bravest thing I have ever witnessed." She was too tired to do more than squeeze his hand, but the love that passed between them needed no words. He climbed carefully into the bed beside her, and she curled against his solid warmth, feeling safer and more content than she had ever felt in her life. The winter passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, of learning to care for this tiny person who depended on them completely. Kade was a surprisingly natural father, patient with the baby's cries and gentle in his handling despite his large, rough hands. He would walk the floor with Mary for hours when she was fussy, singing old songs in his rumbling bass voice until she settled. Spring came again, but Kade did not return to his trap lines. "I am not leaving you with a baby to care for alone," he said firmly when Dawson suggested he might want to go. "There is enough work here in town to keep us fed, and I would rather be with my family than chasing furs in the mountains. You do not miss it?" she asked, concerned that he might grow to resent the domesticity that fatherhood had brought. "I miss the quiet sometimes," he admitted, "but not enough to leave you and Mary. My priorities have changed, Dawson. You too are my life now." By the time Mary was 6 months old and sleeping through most nights, Dawson returned to teaching. Mrs. Colby agreed to watch the baby during school hours, an arrangement that suited everyone. Mary was a happy, healthy child who seemed to have inherited her father's calm temperament and her mother's curiosity. The years rolled by with the steady rhythm of seasons and school terms. Mary grew into a bright, energetic toddler who loved following her father around while he worked and listening to her mother read stories in the evening. When she was 3, Dawson found herself pregnant again, and 9 months later they welcomed a son they named Thomas, after Kade's father. With 2 children and a growing family, their small house felt cramped. Kade spent that summer and fall building an addition, adding 2 more bedrooms and expanding the kitchen. The work was hard, but he seemed to thrive on it, taking pride in creating a home large enough for his expanding family. Thomas was different from Mary, more boisterous, more demanding, with a temper that flared hot and fast. But he adored his father with a fierce devotion, following Kade everywhere and mimicking his every gesture. Watching her husband teach their son how to hammer nails or care for the horses filled Dawson with a contentment so deep, it sometimes brought tears to her eyes. 2 years later came another daughter, Kate, named for no one but herself. She was a serious baby who watched the world with solemn eyes and seemed to understand far more than should be possible for one so young. Then, when Kate was 2, came another son, Daniel, who completed their family. 4 children in 8 years of marriage had transformed their lives completely. The house that had seemed too large now felt just right, filled with noise and laughter, and the constant motion of young people. Kade had given up any pretense of returning to his mountain existence, instead becoming a fixture in Lovelock, the man everyone called when something needed fixing or when trouble threatened. He still growled at men whose eyes lingered too long on his wife, though now she was confident enough to call him on it. "I am a married woman with 4 children," she would tease. "Who exactly do you think is going to steal me away?" "Someone might try," he would growl back, pulling her close. "Best they know from the start that you are thoroughly claimed." "Possessive mountain man," she would murmur, but she would kiss him anyway because after all these years, she still loved his protective intensity. Dawson continued teaching through it all, though she had to take time off for each birth and the immediate postpartum period. The town had grown over the years, and with it the school population. Eventually, they hired a second teacher, a young man from California, to help manage the increased number of students. Dawson found she enjoyed the collaboration, and it allowed her more flexibility to balance her professional and family responsibilities. On their 10th anniversary, Kade surprised her by taking her back to that meadow in the foothills where he had first kissed her. Mrs. Colby watched the children, and they rode out in the early morning just as they had that first time. The meadow was just as beautiful, the spring still bubbling from the rocks, the grass thick and green. "I wanted to bring you back here," Kade said as they sat on the same flat rock, "to remind you of how this started." "As though I could forget," Dawson said, leaning against his shoulder. "You have given me everything I never knew I wanted, Kade. A home, a family, a life filled with love and purpose. I could not have dreamed of anything better." "You gave me back my life," he said simply. "I was just existing before you arrived, going through the motions. You reminded me what it was to truly live, to feel, to hope for the future. Everything good in my life now started the day you stepped off that stagecoach." They made love there in the meadow, sweet and slow under the spring sky, reaffirming the bond that had only grown stronger over the years. Afterward, they lay in the grass talking about their children, their dreams, their plans for the future. "I want to take the children up to my old cabin this summer," Kade said. "Mary is old enough now to appreciate it, and I want them to understand that part of who their father is. That part of their heritage." "I think that is a wonderful idea," Dawson agreed. "Though I confess I am curious to see this legendary cabin. You have talked about it for years, but I have never actually seen it." "It is rough," he warned. "No amenities, barely civilized. But it is beautiful country, and it is where I figured out how to keep living after I thought I had lost everything worth living for." The trip to the cabin happened in July, when school was out and the mountain weather was at its best. They packed supplies and made the journey over 2 days, camping one night under the stars. The children were enchanted by the adventure, even little Daniel, who had to ride in a sling on Kade's back for much of the journey. The cabin was exactly as he had described: one room, a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, rough-hewn and basic. But it was also beautiful in its simplicity, and the location was stunning. Surrounded by pines with a view of distant peaks, a cold stream rushing nearby, it felt like the edge of the world. They stayed for a week, and Dawson watched her husband come alive in a way she had never quite seen before. This was his element, the wild country where he had learned to survive and eventually to thrive. He taught the children how to fish and track animals, how to read the weather and find water. Mary hung on his every word, her adventurous spirit responding to the wilderness. Thomas tried to do everything his father did, occasionally getting frustrated when his small body could not keep up. Kate watched everything with her serious eyes, and Daniel mostly wanted to be held and fed. "Thank you for sharing this with me," Dawson said one evening after the children were asleep, as she and Kade sat by the fire outside the cabin. "I understand you better now, seeing you here. Why you came to this country, what it gave you." "It gave me a place to heal," Kade said. "But you gave me a reason to live again. The mountains will always be part of me, but you and the children are my heart. This is just where I was before I found what truly mattered." They returned to Lovelock at the end of the week, all of them dusty and tired but happy. The children talked about the adventure for months afterward, and Kade promised they would return the following summer and the summer after that. It became a tradition, their annual pilgrimage to the mountains, a reminder of where their family's story had its roots. The years continued their steady march. Mary grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's sharp mind and her father's steady temperament. She announced at 16 that she wanted to become a teacher like her mother, and Dawson could not have been more proud. Thomas was all boy, constantly in motion, constantly testing boundaries, but with a good heart that showed itself when he defended smaller children from bullies or helped elderly neighbors with heavy work. Kate remained serious and thoughtful, often found reading in corners or drawing pictures of the mountains and desert. Daniel was the charmer, able to talk his way out of trouble with a smile and a quick word. All 4 of them were strong, healthy, and deeply loved. Dawson and Kade aged together, their hair showing gray and their bodies wearing the marks of hard work and childbearing. But the love between them never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, deepened by shared experience and mutual respect. They still took walks together in the evenings when they could, still sat on the porch watching sunsets, still held hands when they thought no one was looking. On the evening of their 20th anniversary, surrounded by their children and many friends from the town, Dawson looked around at the life they had built and felt overwhelming gratitude. She had come west looking for independence and adventure, never imagining she would find love with a mountain man who growled at anyone who looked at her too long. But that possessiveness, which she had pretended not to love at first, had been a sign of the deep devotion he felt for her, a devotion that had sustained them through 2 decades of marriage. "What are you thinking?" Kade asked quietly, his arm around her waist as they watched their children laugh and talk with the party guests. "That I am the luckiest woman in Nevada," she said honestly. That you gave me everything I ever wanted and things I did not know I needed. That I love you more today than I did when we married, which I would not have thought possible." He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "The luck was all mine, Dawson. You saved my life in every way that matters. I love you beyond measure, beyond words, beyond reason. For 20 years, and however many more we are blessed with." She turned in his arms to kiss him properly, not caring who might see or what anyone might think. Let them talk. Let the whole town know that the schoolteacher and the mountain man were still desperately in love after all these years. It was nothing to be ashamed of, it was everything to celebrate. As the evening wore on and the party wound down, their children helped clean up while Kade and Dawson slipped away to their porch, their private sanctuary where they had shared so many quiet moments over the years. The stars were brilliant overhead, the desert air cooling rapidly as night fell. "You ever regret it?" Kade asked suddenly. "Giving up Boston society, the life you could have had back east?" Dawson laughed softly. "Not for a single moment. That life would have suffocated me eventually. This life, our life, is everything I needed even when I did not know what I was looking for. You, the children, the teaching, this wild, beautiful country. It all fits together perfectly. Even the possessive mountain man who scares off anyone who looks at you wrong. Especially him," she said firmly. "Though I am no longer pretending I do not love it when you growl at people. I love it quite openly now. Thank you very much." He laughed, that deep rumbling sound she loved, and pulled her into his lap despite her half-hearted protests. "Good. Because I am too old to change my ways now. You are mine, Dawson Dempsey, and I will keep reminding the world of that fact until my last breath." "And I am yours," she agreed, settling comfortably against his chest. "For all our days, whatever may come." They sat together in the darkness, listening to their children's voices from inside the house, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life and a family and a love that would endure through whatever the future might bring. The Wild West had been hard on so many, breaking spirits and bodies with equal cruelty. But for Dawson and Kade, it had been the place where their story began, where a mountain man had growled his claim, and a young woman had found the courage to accept it. And they had lived happily, fully, completely, surrounded by love and family and the enduring beauty of the Nevada mountains. Their story was not one of grand adventure or dramatic rescues, though it had contained elements of both. It was a story of two wounded souls finding healing in each other, of quiet devotion and steady love, of building something lasting in a temporary world. It was, in the end, exactly the story both of them had needed, even if neither had known they were looking for it. And as they sat together under the vast western sky, both of them knew with absolute certainty that they would not change a single moment of it. The journey had been worth it, the destination everything they had hoped for, and the love they shared would endure long after the stars themselves had faded from the sky. Their children grew and eventually had children of their own. Mary became a teacher as she had wanted, taking over Dawson's position when her mother finally retired at the age of 55. Thomas worked with his father doing carpentry and handyman work around the expanding town. Kate surprised everyone by becoming an artist, her paintings of the Nevada landscape gaining recognition even beyond Lovelock. And Daniel, the charmer, went into business running the general store after the original owner retired. Kade and Dawson became grandparents, then great-grandparents, watching their family tree spread and flourish. They aged gracefully together, their bodies slowing but their minds sharp and their love undiminished. On summer evenings, they could still be found on their porch, holding hands and watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light. Kade never did return to living in the mountains full time, though he and Dawson made the trip to the old cabin every year until physical limitations made it impossible. The cabin remained standing, a reminder of where he had been and how far he had come, a testament to the man he had been before love had transformed him into something softer but no less strong. When Kade was 73 and Dawson 70, they took one final trip to the meadow where he had first kissed her. Their children worried it was too much for them, but they insisted, and Thomas accompanied them to ensure their safety. But he stayed back at a respectful distance, allowing his parents' privacy in the place that held so many memories. "We have had a good run," Kade said, his voice still deep though softer with age. "Better than I ever imagined possible." "The best," Dawson agreed, leaning against him just as she had all those decades before. "I would not change a single thing, not even my growling," she laughed, the sound younger than her years. "Especially not the growling. It is how I knew from the start that you were mine as much as I was yours." They sat together in the afternoon sun, two people who had defied expectations and built a love story for the ages. Not a story that would be written in history books or remembered beyond their descendants, but a true story nonetheless of courage and devotion, of two people who had each been broken and had made themselves whole together. When they finally returned to town that evening, both of them moved a little slower, their bodies reminding them of the passage of time. But their hands were still entwined, their love still evident in every glance and gesture. They had lived their story fully, and it had been beautiful. Years later, when Kade passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 81, Dawson grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been married for 54 years, and every single one of those years had been a gift. She lived another 4 years without him, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who all carried pieces of the love story she and Kade had created. On the day before she died, peaceful and ready in her bed with her family gathered around, Dawson's last words were about that first day in Lovelock. "I saw him growl at a man who was staring at me," she said, her voice weak but clear. "And I pretended not to love it. But I loved it from the very first moment, and I loved him for every moment after." She closed her eyes then, a smile on her weathered face, and slipped away to join the mountain man who had claimed her heart more than half a century before. They buried her beside him in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Lovelock, where the mountains she had learned to love stood eternal watch. And if you visit that cemetery even now, you can see their headstones standing together. Kade Dempsey, beloved husband and father, and Dawson Thatcher Dempsey, beloved wife and mother. The dates tell you they lived long lives, but they do not tell you the most important truth: that they loved each other completely, that they built something beautiful together, that their story was one of the great romances of the American West, even if only their descendants knew it. Because that is the nature of true love stories. They do not require an audience or recognition. They require only two people who choose each other, again and again, through all the joys and sorrows that life brings. Kade and Dawson had been those people, and their love had been the kind that echoes through generations, teaching children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren what it means to truly commit to another person. The mountain man who growled at anyone who looked too long at his wife, and the woman who learned to love his possessive protection, they had found each other in Lovelock, Nevada in the summer of 1877, and they had built a love that lasted until death parted them and beyond. Their story was complete, their ending as perfect as any love story can hope to achieve. And somewhere in the eternal places where spirits go, two souls found each other again, young and strong once more, ready to continue the adventure that had begun with a growl and a blush on a dusty street in the Wild West. Their love story had come full circle, and it was beautiful. It was real. It was theirs, forever and always.